In the last few weeks, there's been renewed speculation about a potential Russian attack on one of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, or maybe all three, or maybe somewhere else within the NATO alliance. Those speculations have put time horizons of before the end of the decade, so that would give us 5 years to prepare, or even as short as 6 months. So, what is the likelihood of Russia attacking one of the three Baltic states, and in what kind of time horizon could we expect that to happen? Привет, I'm here in Odessa, Mama, on the shores of Black Sea, a city that has been the victim of Russian imperial aggression over the last 3 years since the extended invasion by Moscow of Ukraine in February 2022. So this is a city that knows about the risks of Russia attacking them. We have regular drone and missile attacks by Russia on this city. So when people are looking at the possibility of Russia attacking one of the three Baltic states, the big indicator that this is less likely to happen, that's normally cited, is the fact that Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are members of NATO. There is a collective security guarantee contained in Article 5 of the treaty. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union never tested that to the extent that anyone invoked Article 5. At the time, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were part of the Soviet Union, not part of NATO. So that Article 5, in terms of Europe, has never been actually tested, and the wording of it is a little bit ambiguous about what kind of support would be given. However, US foreign policy over the last 80 years, until at least pretty recently, has been to indicate that an attack by Soviet Union, or it can be any non-NATO member state, but historically it was the Soviet Union or its successor state, Russia, on one of the members of NATO would lead to military support from, most importantly, the United States, the world's premier military power, against the invaders to evict them. Doesn't mean that it would escalate to a nuclear exchange. However, it means that they would take specific military actions to liberate those territories if they were occupied, for example. However, since Donald Trump came back into the US presidency and took over, his administration has been, and actually before, if we look at Donald Trump's language and rhetoric when describing NATO, he doesn't seem to be a big fan of it and has weakened the deterrence effect that worked so well during the Cold War by saying things like he would, I'm paraphrasing a little, but he would basically cheer Russia on in certain circumstances if they were attacked a member state of NATO that wasn't paying, in his opinion, enough on their own defense. And by allowing this element of ambiguity, it would give the Russians a reason to test what would actually happen in the case of Article 5. It doesn't mean that they're going to start rolling tanks towards Tallinn in Estonia immediately. They may do something that's a lot lower threshold as a provocation. It could be, for example, grabbing just a small piece of territory. It might even be inhabited. It could be just some woodland or something. But more likely it would be somewhere that is actually going to be inhabited, but small, and then judge the reaction. Maybe doing what they did back in Crimea in 2014 by using soldiers that were known as Little Green Men and don't have any insignia indicating that they're Russian forces, for example. So we don't know exactly what the Trump administration would do if there was an attack on one of the three Baltic states by Moscow, and whether that would lead to a military intervention by the US. My feeling, having looked at, or my assessment, having looked at Donald Trump's behavior and his administration, voting with Russia on UN resolutions, not condemning the Russian aggression against Ukraine on the anniversary, for example, cutting off Ukrainian supplies of weapons and intel, which was rather crucial when they were defending the part of Russia that they have been occupying in the Kursk Oblast, doesn't bode well for, along with Donald Trump's continuously saying he's going to get tough on Putin and tweeting out angry stuff and then really not doing anything substantive. and a lot of, shall we say, indicators coming out of the Trump administration that they actually want to restore kind of diplomatic, not just diplomatic relations with Russia, but also economic ties. So all this indicates that there is enough of ambiguity that we don't really know what the US would do, and you couldn't say that beforehand with such clarity that there is that ambiguity there. So that is a reason why Russia may want to test it. However, they face one big issue. Their forces are tied up in this country, been trying to invade it since, or occupy it and control it since 2014 when they first started the Russo-Ukrainian war. And they are basically stuck in the east and the south of the country. They haven't made much progress since the early days of the invasion the extended invasion back in 2022. And currently they control a little bit less than 19% of Ukraine's territory. Bear in mind that Ukraine is a huge country. It's the biggest country entirely contained in Europe. So yeah, it is big. So even 19% is still a large chunk of territory. It's bigger than the Baltic States. However, their primary objective is to politically subjugate this country. So at the very least, if they can't control and annex it all, then at least install a puppet government so that it is effectively going to be under Moscow's boot once again and be pliant with the Kremlin's demands, a bit like we see currently with Lukashenko in Belarus. So because their forces are tied up, the Russian army is over 600,000 at the moment, and they're all tied up here, and their best troops are here, presumably, that they have left, because we just passed the 1 million Russian casualty milestone, if we believe that that's an accurate figure or not, just this week. So they probably couldn't afford to take away enough troops and materiel in order to actually grab somewhere specific in one of the 3 Baltic states. For now, also the 3 Baltic states have been mining their borders, making it more difficult to invade. And with satellite imagery today, even the commercial satellite image, never mind what the US intelligence services can actually see, we would get probably some indicators before. They may use some subterfuge like some military exercise with Belarus, which is scheduled for September, for example, to cloak that buildup of troops on the border. They did this before the 2022 invasion with Ukraine, where they were moving troops also to Belarus, of which they attacked towards Kiev. So they could move small forces this way. However, in order to actually make a significant incursion, then they would presumably need a lot of those troops that are currently tied up. So the big indicator that Russia will, in fact, attack one of the 3 Baltic states is if the fighting stops in Ukraine. Now that can stop with a Russian victory, which would basically mean at least taking political control of most of Ukraine and of Kiev. That seems a very distant possibility, a very low likely probability, definitely in the next couple of years with the rate of progress they've been making. And we recently saw Ukraine's ability to project its power into Russia itself, its military power, with the Operation Spider's Web, where they took out many of Russia's strategic bombers that were 4,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, using this very innovative strategy with drone warfare. So whilst Russia has made absolutely no effort to have a truce or a ceasefire or anything like that in the last 5 months since Donald Trump became president once again, this actually might be, at a certain point later this year, in Russia's interest to acquiesce to, but not because they want peace, but simply because they want to move those troops out of the theater of operations here in Ukraine and use them to, at a very minimum, intimidate the Baltic states. They've already started to build up some infrastructure in the Baltics that they could later move troops and materiel to, and then they could launch some sort of incursion, whether it's a minor incursion, to quote Joe Biden before the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, or some more significant incursion. That remains to be seen. They could then move them there. However, well, if they do that, then maybe Ukraine would just break the whatever truce they've agreed and be able to attack along the line of contact here in Ukraine. They could just take that risk and think that trying to undermine the credibility of Article 5 of NATO and testing it would be a better strategic aim at this point in their war against, at that point it would be war against Europe and war against NATO. And rather than continue focusing here and waiting years and years and years to perhaps win in Ukraine, but probably lose. So the first indication that we'll see is some sort of ceasefire. I did predict back at the beginning of the year that there's about a 40% likelihood of a ceasefire or some sort of truce, a temporary pause in fighting, not an end to the war whatsoever, by the end of the year. And it would almost certainly come later in the year when Russia starts to run out of money, manpower, and materiel. They need solutions to all those three major issues this year. So if, for example, the oil price drops, as Saudi Arabia indicates it's going to increase production, then maybe Russia starts to think, okay, we just don't have the resources to win here in Ukraine. Let's pause it, but let's take those battle-hardened troops and move them to the less experienced and protected NATO border on the three Baltic states and test whether Article 5 is actually credible or not. And as a barrier, they could either just accept the Ukrainians might counterattack, or they may actually ask North Korea for more troops to actually just station there as a barrier on the line of contact. Remains to be seen. There are some solutions for that. So the big indicator is going to be some sort of pause in fighting here in Ukraine that will free up the available resources for Ukraine to move, for Russia to move their troops. Actually, Ukraine may also move their troops around if the Baltic states were attacked and actually support the three Baltic states in their defense. It would be in Ukraine's strategic interest to do so. So they will move them there and then presumably try a provocation. And the longer they wait before doing provocation, the more time they give to the three Baltic states to bolster their defenses, for the Europeans to get their act together better, independent of the US, and actually move troops and materiel in situ there to act as a deterrence to Russia. So probably we would see it happen pretty quickly, but it would not be a huge invasion like we saw in 2022 against Ukraine, where they're trying to seize the capital. I don't see that happening. That would be such a big event that it would put a lot of pressure on the US to react with some sort of military intervention. However, if it's just a minor incursion and they seize somewhere like in Latvia, Daugavpils, or another small town that I think the other one is called Urezkene, there near the Russian border, or Narva, where I went to as well over the winter, right on the border town between Russia and Estonia, or something similar like that, where they just take a small place and then maybe with the subterfuge of plausible deniability, oh, we don't know who those people are who just suddenly seized the town in Narva or Daugavpils or somewhere else, or maybe this Suwałki gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus that straddles the border between Poland and Lithuania, and then they see the reaction. Because if it's something that they have plausible deniability, it's a minor incursion, and say it's Lithuania and they try to invoke Article 5, who will respond concretely? Will the US under Donald Trump send troops to die, US troops to die defending Suwałki, or that's the town in Poland, or some small Lithuanian border town that they can't even pronounce? Will the other European allies of the three Baltic states intervene? Will Finland and Sweden? I think highly likely they would send material support, either in terms of troops or military equipment. Would the UK and France become directly involved? Would Germany? Seems as we go down the list, it becomes less and less likely. And that will be a way to test whether Article 5 can be invoked or not. If it suddenly looks like the US is going to send troops and Donald Trump has had a change of heart and wants to kick out Russian forces, no matter what insignia they have on, then maybe Russia would just withdraw them and say, okay, they called our bluff, we tried to call their bluff, but actually it turns out it is a good deterrence, and then everyone agrees not to escalate to a nuclear exchange, and the Russians could withdraw. So the likelihood of having much of a downside for Russia in that scenario, I would say, is pretty low, in the sense that they could always have plausible deniability, withdraw the troops if it really turned out that the deterrence was credible. But if it's not credible, they could just hold on to that territory and then make it a fait accompli, the new situation, and then say to countries like the Baltic states, look, your allies are not coming to save you, you need to acquiesce to our demands, and then they'll have a long list of them, and Russia may agree even to withdraw the troops, or it may want to keep the territory and have some promise not to invade more. Russia, in fact, they have recently demanded again that NATO withdraw from the three Baltic states completely. Why would they want that? Why would that be in the interest of Russia? Not because Russia is scared of an invasion by Finland or the three Baltic states, it's because, well, if there are no NATO troops there, then they're easier to invade. If we just the local troops, it's not really rocket science why Russia, as an aggressive military imperial power, would make those kind of demands. They also made similar demands, but actually even bigger, before the 2022 extended invasion. They sent NATO a draft treaty. Hey, you guys just leave all those countries and withdraw and roll it back so that they're unprotected. And when you think about it, it would have been a lot easier for Moscow to have seized the three Baltic states militarily if they weren't in NATO, compared to trying to take a whole huge country like Ukraine. So I'll leave it at that. We will probably see towards the end of the year as things develop. First, we'll look to see whether there suddenly is some sort of cessation of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine here. That would be the first big indicator that the Baltic states are probably in a lot of trouble in terms of some sort of Russian provocation to test Article 5. Of course, they will not, well, it's almost certain they wouldn't do a full-scale invasion of the Baltics immediately, because that would be more likely to trigger Article 5 and a military intervention by the three Baltic states allies, whether it's the UK, France, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, the US, but a small one, then that is something that would be a lot more plausible. There was actually, in the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler was violating all the previous agreements that had been signed by Germany, the French fascists, to undermine support for reaction to Germany seizing what was Danzig at the time, or Gdansk in modern-day Poland, there was a slogan they had was, "Why die for Gdansk?" Or it was, why die for Danzig? They were using the German name. It was actually, sounds better in English than it does in French. Pourquoi mourir pour Danzig? Doesn't have the same ring to it as why die for Danzig, because their argument was it's just this insignificant kind of town on the borderlands between at the time Germany and Poland. It had a special status. There were a lot of ethnic Germans there, and they probably would have argued also that most French people couldn't find it on a map. Expect something similar if that is the case. So on that note, I'll leave it there. Fingers crossed that this doesn't come to pass. However, we could see possibly by the end of the year, this time frame of 6 months is not completely out of the question, or early next year, some sort of testing of Article 5 by Russia. But it almost certainly would require that the Russians stop fighting here temporarily in order to free up the military assets to launch such a provocation. Drop your comments down below what you think of the likelihood where it might happen. My guess is actually somewhere like Daugavpils or Rezkine in eastern Latvia, where you have a lot of Russian-speaking people there, and you have a train line, and it's kind of sticking out a little bit. They could maybe seize one or two of those towns, or even just a smaller town nearby, and test Article 5. That way, it could also be obviously in Estonia or in Lithuania, or even in Poland, or maybe even Finland, but I think they're way less likely. If you're planning to come here to Ukraine, then I have my guide down below. Not just the logistical information about how to stay as safe as possible and what you should do to get the most out of your trip here to Ukraine if you are that way minded. Of course, normal caveat, this is the country with the biggest war in Europe since World War II. Obviously, you need to bear that in mind if you're going to come here, but there are a lot of people who come who are doing humanitarian work, just want to be here and experience, especially in Lviv, and who are maybe helping with the military effort and the defense of this country. Also got my hospitality guide that I've been updating recently for the best cafes, restaurants, and shisha lounges, bars, etc. that you will find in cities like Lviv, Chernovtsi, Uzhhorod, Kiev, and here in Odessa, Mama. So it saves you just a lot of time and you get a lot more out of your trip. It also helps motivate me to make more videos for this geopolitics channel, as it's still not monetized as yet, but I'm doing this as a public service, as I have a background in international relations. So my expertise is I speak Ukrainian and Russian, and I've been living on and off in this region, in particular Ukraine, since for over a decade at this point. So I'm here to give you a more nuanced and informed and unique perspective on what is going on. I'm also spending a lot of time in the three Baltic states over the last 18 months. So also I can give you some ideas about what it's like in those countries, and fingers crossed that it is just something that doesn't happen. However, I'm getting the when I analyze things, I'm getting the impression that it is becoming more and more likely. But again, we will have to see what happens here in the next, say, 4 or 5 months or so, and then we can make a better informed judgment of about what's likely to happen in the 3 Baltic states. Next big date will be the Zapad maneuvers between Russia and Belarus, which is scheduled for September. That is the earliest time that anyone foresees some sort of provocation against one of the 3 Baltic states or Poland. And in the meantime, let's hope that Ukraine does its best and has more operations like Operation Spiderweb that undermine Russian imperialism and their capacity to attack, in particular, the civilians here in Europe, whether it's Ukraine or in the Baltic states. So I got the Farmers Forces t-shirt on today, but I will end it as always with Slava Ukraini, Heroям Slava, do peremоги.